Carried out to sea. Part 2. A day of pain, tragedy and panic ends. At last. Suddenly, I could see light, through the darkness of the water. But I could live no longer without air, so I took a deep breath of fresh, clean air. It was a miracle. I was on top of the water. As I drew in the life-giving air, I began to take stock. I moved my arms first, and was surprised to find that they were still there. Then I tried my legs. They were still a part of my body too, and I could move them. I could see, but I couldn't hear. The water had been so heavy against my ears that, for the moment, my hearing was gone. I was alone in an angry but soundless sea. Then I began to swim, awkwardly indeed, but well enough to get into quieter water beyond the rocks. I was surprised that I could float so easily until I noticed that I was holding on to a piece of wood. It was painted green and was about as long and as wide as my body. I raised myself out of the water, as much as I could, and shouted, "Help!" My hearing was coming back, and my own voice frightened me. Then I saw the shore, far away, and the great breakers between, and I knew that no one could hear me. I could see cars moving slowly along the shore road, as though they were full of happy people quite uninterested in me. A little safer. I noticed several boards still held together in one piece, like a raft. They were floating toward me. I swam to them and climbed aboard. The raft was big enough for only half of my body, but I lay across it and felt safer. I was higher out of the water now. I kept thinking of the dangers from below, the man-eating fish. But I quieted this fear with a little reasoning. In a tidal wave, most fish would surely seek the safety of the ocean bottom. My panic left me and I looked around. It was then that I saw the others. On the top of a high wave, I counted 7 children. Some were holding on to pieces of broken buildings, 2 were holding on to a floating tree. "Hello!" I shouted. But they didn't shout back. They just looked at me with glassy eyes. Later, I looked down from the top of a big wave, and saw a small boy on a board. He began to work toward me, and I toward him. "What's your name?" I asked.
"Thomas Fujimoto. You're Miss McGinnis?"
"Yes," I said, and we floated close enough for me to take his hand for a moment. "Where were you when the wave came in?"
"In the school washroom,"
he answered. So the wave had got up that far. That was why I had seen so many children. "Hold on," I said as we floated away from each other. Time had little meaning now, for my body was full of pain. I could feel cuts all over me. I had bitten through my lower lip, and couldn't close my mouth without pain. I was getting colder. A strong wind was blowing, and a cold rain had started. A better raft. My raft was beginning to fall to pieces. Then I saw a larger one coming toward me. Finally, it floated near enough for me to swim to it. This one was big enough to lie on. But when I moved a little to the right or to the left, it turned over, and I was in the water again. It seemed to me that I climbed aboard that thing 1,000 times. Now I began to hear planes overhead. I got on my knees on the raft and waved my arms. Again and again, this made my raft turn over. Each time I would climb aboard, balance myself carefully and wait for the next plane. While I waited, I counted the things that floated by. I counted 8 hens, probably from Mr. Nakano's house next to ours. Then there was Faye's purse, which she had carried the first time I ever saw her. A moment later, my own purse went floating by. It had been safely put away in my room. And there was a picture of Mrs. Nakano, which Mr. Nakano always kept on a table in their living room, a book titled Literature and Life, and Dottie's writing table from her bedroom. Supper hour. The sea was carrying me around a point. Laupahoehoe had disappeared long ago, and now, Ookalla was coming into sight. When I saw the houses of Ookalla, I began to shout again. But it was growing late. People would be sitting down to supper, with those they loved. I was alone and forgotten, and death seemed very near. Then another plane flew over me, this time so low that I could see the flyer himself. I waved as hard as I could, went over into the water as usual, and climbed back aboard the raft. But I didn't care. He had seen me. He turned, came back and dropped a big package. I swam to it. The large black letters on the outside told me what to do: to inflate, pull the string. That's all there was to it. Like a miracle, the raft inflated and I climbed aboard. I lay in the bottom, limp and at peace. For the first time, since I had come up for air at the lighthouse, I could rest. There was no fear of falling off, no balancing, no waving or shouting. I was in heaven. Like a storybook. It was then I saw the little boat coming toward me. It was so close, I wondered why I hadn't seen it before. The man in the front of the boat was Leobert Fernandez. This can't be true, I thought. It's too much like a storybook. But it was indeed Leobert. He had rushed to the shore as soon as he heard about the tidal wave. Somehow he had found a boat and had gone out to rescue anyone he could find. He was dressed for swimming and looked wonderfully strong and safe and good. He reached out and held the raft and the boat together with his hands. The waves rolled under us.
"Are you all right?"
he asked. I could not answer.
"Marsu, can you climb into the boat?"
I found my voice. I haven't any clothes on,
"Never mind,"
he said. He climbed on the raft, wrapped me in a blanket, and lifted me into the boat. 2 schoolboys were also aboard. One was lying limp in the bottom, looking more dead than alive. The other was sitting up facing the shore, a bandage around his head. His face showed no feeling at all, and his eyes were glassy. It was the same look I had seen on those other childish faces, rolling about in the waves. There was a quiet, sad-faced crowd waiting on the shore, waiting for Dottie and Helen and Faye and Thomas Fujimoto and 169 others who would never come home. I was lifted out, and Leobert carried me to his car. The 2 boys were carried to the car too, and we started for the hospital. There, covered with blankets, I still shook with cold. My lips stayed blue for hours. Finally, I went to sleep and slept for 24 hours. When I woke up, Leobert was sitting beside my bed. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, very gently, he said,
"Marsu, will you marry me?"
I couldn't say anything, because my lower lip had been sewn up and was covered with white bandages. But we have lived very happily ever after.